to the Broken Hearts Club podcast. I'm Brooke Bergman. I'm a marriage and family therapist, relationship expert, and dangerously hopeful instigator of change. I believe in the power of love and the power of knowledge. I want this podcast to be a place where the stigma of our vulnerabilities are broken and open conversations around relationships, mental health, spirituality, and business are had with the purpose of elevating your mind and heart to the next stage of growth.
So before I introduce you to my next interview, I wanted to introduce the series that I am starting, the direction that I'm taking my podcast in, which is why it's taken me a while to get back going, because it's been on my heart for quite a while. I've been in conversation with a number of people, friends and colleagues, about this subject. And this particular subject requires quite a bit of bravery on my part, which is why I've been so reluctant. And so I'm calling this series Finding Faith After Certainty. And it's really, really close to my heart for a lot of different reasons. As the title suggests, it's about finding faith again, or for the first time, actually, in some ways, after certainty. I grew up in fundamentalist evangelical America, which is all about certainty. And the more and more I grew and evolved, the more uncertain, quite frankly, I became. Not only about evangelicalism, but a lot of, that's the big thing, which I hope to begin unpacking through these series of interviews that I'll be doing. And also just my own reflections, and sharing a bit of my own story and my own faith journey. Because as the conversations I've been having with different folks, it seems like I'm not alone in this journey, that a lot of people, grew up with certain religious traditions and are really trying in their own ways to find their faith now, because for a lot of us, I'll speak for me, but I think for a lot of people, faith offered a lot of things, or I'm not even going to say faith, religious life, spiritual belief systems, offered a lot of things that, are actually very positive. And so for many of us, we maybe went through a crisis of faith, or transition into actual faith, through a variety of maybe personal experiences. For me, it was my divorce back in 2015, but it was really the end of a long process that had been ongoing, actually, for me. In some ways, my divorce was actually, the bigger divorce was the divorce from the evangelical church, and also just institutional church in general, at least for me. I've come to a certain peace about kind of where I've landed with church and all of that. And I know that for a lot of people, and I know that the pandemic heightened this as well, where it became sort of confusing as to like what church meant for people. And so I want to have these conversations and to share these conversations about, what it looks like to move from one paradigm to another is really what I'm talking about. So paradigm shifting. And how does one do that? For me, the way I've characterized it for myself is that I actually feel in some ways that my faith is just as real, if not more real, because I allow for the uncertainty. I allow for nuance. I allow for, I just allow for things to be unclear now, for things to be murky, for things to be messy. I would say that in my certainty days, I was a lot less tolerant of mess. I mean, I guess you could say I'm still not that tolerant of mess. As my husband and kids will attest, that sometimes I will, as some moms do, just lose it on occasion. Like, oh my gosh, it's so messy around here. But we all have our journeys. Gosh, all this to say, this is a sort of a long introduction to the next interview, but it's really more of an introduction to a series that I want to do, which is a series of conversations around faith and religion and also relationships. I think that that's another huge piece that, as I've dug into my own personal journey, that isn't talked about enough, is how much our faith communities tie into our relationships, and for better and for worse. And so I think that that's an important thing to discuss, and to begin to shed some light on, because I remember doing research when I was in graduate school about abusive relationships, and how abusive relationships tend to go into more, how do I say this, rigid constructions of religion. And that's one way of saying it. There's a lot more to unpack around that. But suffice it to say, that those two go hand in hand. And so obviously in my own personal journey, that's been a big part of me trying to figure out, well, what the hell happened, right? And that's what I hope this podcast to be, as a place where we can just listen and learn, and maybe my hope is that you unpack and reflect a little more on your journey and your process, and what your life has looked like up until now, and what are the forces that have shaped who you are, for better and for worse. And what paradigms are you maybe learning to move into? So anyway, I'd love to hear from you about that. I've resurrected an old email address that I used to have, and that is info at Brooke, BROOKE, Bergman, BERGMAN.com. If you want to send any sort of questions or comments about the podcast, or the conversations, or maybe just you want to share how it impacted you, I'd love to hear. I became a therapist because I love connecting with people, and I love to see people, and I love just expanding the circle. And so I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, without further ado, here is the first interview in the series.
Hello, everybody. I am so excited to introduce to you a good friend and colleague. Her name is Michelle Morrow.
And I got to know her when I was in graduate school a long, long time ago. It feels like an eternity ago. And we've sort of stayed connected over the years through social media, mostly. You know, we've both moved to different parts of the country. And, you know, as it so happens, our stories started to share some similarities. And so her and I started reconnecting recently. And I'm so excited to share her with you because I think her story is compelling. And I think that for a lot of us, we can relate. You know, I know that a lot of us former evangelicals are really trying to find a way forward now. And we're not sure what that looks like now. And so it's helpful to have these conversations and just have these conversations. So here's Michelle. Michelle Morrow is a spiritual coach, church consultant, and content creator working for LGBTQ inclusion in Christian spaces. With graduate degrees in theology and higher education administration, Michelle integrates her love for biblical study, spiritual formation, and teaching in the work that she does. Though a native Californian, Michelle lives near Nashville, Tennessee with her wife, Kim, and their rescue fur babies, a pup named Zoe, and two crazy cats named Pismo and Brax. You can read her blog and learn more about her coaching and consulting practices at michellefmorrow.com. And I'll be including a link to that in my social media announcements. Michelle, how are you doing today?
Great. Yeah, I'm glad that we're sitting down for this conversation.
I know. I'm like a little bit starstruck because you're so smart. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to ask smart people questions, which is really silly. But also not like, I'm just so thrilled, to be talking with you. So I guess the first question that I would have for you, Michelle, that I would love for you to share is, tell me and whoever, whatever souls feel called to listen to this interview, your church history. Like, how long have you been going to church? Do you go to church now? Like, what's your kind of church narrative? And I know I'm asking a really, really big question, but like, let's get it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I started going to church when I was a teenager, like just before high school, during high school. My parents started going to church, to a Southern Baptist church, small town, Northern California, kind of traditional preacher at first.
Okay.
And so that was sort of my introduction to church. That was my first church experience. And we were religious about going several times a week throughout my high school years. And then because of, sort of my formation in that space and what it meant for me to be a good Christian girl, I went on to attend a Christian college.
Okay, of course.
And so that was sort of like being in church all the time, right? I mean, it was sort of a surrogate church, I guess, when church home was several hours away. But yeah, I think mostly existed in kind of evangelical church spaces. I kind of hopped around with whoever was going where on a given Sunday. And so, and then of course, sort of chapel services throughout the week and things like that. So lots of church spaces throughout those years. And then after college and soon after college, I went to seminary. And so I continued to go to church, mostly kind of evangelical conservative churches. In that time, I spent several months in an Episcopal church, which was quite a shift for me, and sort of a breath of fresh air at that point, when I was in seminary and shortly after. And then, from there, it really has been when I moved back to Fresno, to the area where I went to college. I was then almost exclusively involved in Mennonite Brethren churches. So again, I would categorize that as sort of conservative evangelical space. And was there until I just recently moved to Tennessee a couple of years ago. So was a member of a Mennonite Brethren church until just a couple of years ago. And since then, I've been going to, going in air quotes, just because of the pandemic, everything's been virtual. And for me, I haven't been attending live. I've been connecting through listening to, the sermons and stuff like that, that are recorded to a progressive Christian church. They're not denominational. They're not tied to a particular denomination, just a kind of independent church in the Nashville area.
Okay.
So I guess I'm not going to church right now because I'm not actually physically going anywhere. But I'd say that's the church that I'm most connected to currently, but I'm not a member anywhere currently, not heavily involved in a particular church currently.
Sure.
So I feel like still most of my days are occupied with what could be called as church work, just because it's more, it's still very much involved in Christian spaces and church, working with churches and things like that. So for the most part, I mean, I would say the majority of my history is in evangelical spaces. And even in the last few years, as I've been trying to be an agent of change in some of those spaces, was still kind of existing in them until my most recent move here to Tennessee. Then, more kind of self-identified progressive Christian church.
Okay. How would you define? Now, I know I didn't add this on my list of questions to you, but as we're talking, I'm thinking it's relevant. How would you define evangelicalism? Because I think that for a lot of people, they don't even know that they are evangelical, or that maybe they came from that. Like, what does that mean to you? And why have you felt the need to shift from evangelicalism?
It's a good question, because I feel like there's sort of two definitions for me. One is, evangelicalism could be, a technical term as far as certain denominations or certain churches, either that self-identify as evangelical or just kind of very shaped by kind of that culture within, especially the American church, context. And then I feel like there's evangelicalism that is, not necessarily a technical term, but more of a catch-all or a generalization for a certain type of, church or church culture or religious or theological culture. And for me, some of those main things that would kind of clue me into kind of an evangelical space would be a certain idea of the Bible, especially being, sort of the language that typically gets used that would clue me into this is an evangelical space would be language like infallible or inerrant. Language like, the Bible is the sole authority for our life. Lots of authority language. I'd say an attitude or an approach to the Bible that is more, sometimes more literal, but I think also sometimes just more sort of restrictive or conservative in the sense of trying to preserve or conserve kind of the way it's always been, or a perception of the way that it's always been. Reaching back to, we have to make sure that everything stays this way. There's this one defined, prescribed, boundaried truth that then, it's fixed, it's more static. And so when we go to the Bible or we think about the Bible, it's sort of, you go there for an answer or a rule or, this thing that's been predetermined, and you extract that and then sort of apply it to your life usually in a pretty wooden way.
Sure. Extract, apply. Extract,
Yes.
apply.
You know, you're trying to look for those one-to-one correlations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, kind of what's the rule for my life, or what's the right, you know, it's the one right answer.
Okay.
So any of that kind of approach to the Bible would often be sort of that code word or that language that would say, okay, if this isn't a technically evangelical church, it's definitely a church or a space that's been shaped by, you know, has the evangelical, evangelicalism DNA in their community. So the Bible and the approach to the Bible is a big one. I think the other one really is kind of to overgeneralize to make it succinct, is sort of in a culture that's very much, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of isolated. It's a very boundaried culture that says, you know, we are on the inside. We have to kind of, we've got sort of the corner on the market when it comes to like the truth, what's right. We're sort of, I'd say, you know, evangelicalism, very much the posture is sort of us against the outer culture or the world, or, you know, it's a, you know, we're in, it's pretty boundaried, it's kind of social arrangement, community identity that sees it's pretty tight within the inside, and it's very kind of all inclusive usually, as far as, you know, I mean, I think one of the reasons why evangelicalism is so, number one, so attractive to a lot of people, but number two, really then hard to leave, is that it becomes your entire world, your entire social network, your entire social network. Everything in your life kind of feeds through, you know, whether it's the particular church or the denomination or whatever it is. It's sort of this way of doing community that is, everything is right here. This is where you draw all your identity. This is where you get all your answers. This is where you do all the life stuff. And then everything on the outside is usually met with a certain amount of either suspect, you know, so it's like church against culture, or with sort of I would say a condescension or a paternalism that is like, we have to save the people on the outside. Either, you know, I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic, I guess, which betrays how I kind of feel about this kind of culture, but you know, it's sort of, we either feel sorry for you because you're lost on the outside and we need to save you, or we are threatened, you know, we feel a threat. You know, your presence is a sense of threat. It's us against them. It's right, wrong. It's very dualistic. And it's, you know, you're sort of, everything on the outside is a potential threat to what's trying to be preserved on the inside. So those are the two main things that I would say that really are kind of, like I said, part of the DNA of evangelicalism is the approach to the Bible, and maybe the approach to kind of social identity and functioning.
Michelle, that was an incredible definition. Thank you. And also super affirming to just, or I guess just validating emotionally to hear you articulate that so succinctly, because that is definitely how I felt being a part of the evangelical spaces. It was very much like all encompassing. And there was definitely this fear of even questioning things, you know, because it is everybody and everything. Now, I kind of want to shift a little bit using what you just shared to venture into the realm of sexuality, because I think this is a realm where evangelicals really like to make up rules, or not, excuse me, they would not say make up. Right? I'm the line, I'm showing my outsider status at this point, right? That I
enforce and protect the rules, maybe.
Yes, right. You know, that this is an arena in which I think ignites a lot of anxiety for evangelicals, because sexuality is, well, it's really very powerful and big and wide and varied. And so I want to shift the conversation just a little bit towards the Exodus ministry that you were involved in. Because I think that I just want to share with, as you and I talked about on the phone, even before we decided to do this, that I feel like there are a lot of people who were in the space that you were in, and maybe don't know what it's like to move from one place to another. And so I'd like to hear a little bit more, or I think people would benefit to hear more about your time with Exodus Ministry and how you got involved with them. And then, how you decided to maybe shift out of that space. Like, what did that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, really my introduction to, again, I feel like in the same way that I can kind of give a technical definition to evangelicalism and sort of a more broad definition. The same really applies to Exodus. So Exodus International was an organization that operated for 30 plus years.
Wow, was it 30 years?
Yeah,
Gosh,
they were founded in the 70s. And then I don't remember the exact year that they shut down, but it was, it's been in the last 10 years.
I was going to say painfully recently.
Yeah. 2013, maybe? It might have been 2013. So my first introduction, and I would say, so Exodus more broadly, other than just like the actual organization, really can be used as shorthand for like the ExGay movement. Because
thank you for that. Yeah.
I think, well, even now, since Exodus International itself is no longer, it shut down, there are other organizations that are continuing on sort of this next, continuing on. The ExGay movement still lives, is still active. But
they just don't use that
organizations, other organizations have decided to pick up the mantle after Exodus shut down. And they decided to shut themselves down. Exodus did. Because they recognized the damage that was being done in people's lives. And so there are those that were involved in sort of the broader ministry that still believe in sort of reparative therapy, conversion therapy, if you want to call it that, and still believe in, sort of the main idea of the ExGay movement. And so have continued that work beyond even when the main organization that really was sort of controlling the movement has decided to shut down. So it's still active, but my introduction...
It's still going, just Exodus as in name.
Yeah, so
is no longer.
Yeah, my introduction would have been to sort of ExGay Theology first, before I knew about Exodus as an organization. So I began to become aware of, same-sex attractions when I was a teenager. It actually coincides with my introduction to church, because it was when my parents found out about, again, like with air quotes, my struggles, because this is not the language that I would use now to describe somebody who's experiencing some sort of, normal heterosexual kind of attraction or something. But the language that I definitely would have used then is, my struggles or my temptations. So when I was journaling about those, sort of coming out to myself, kind of trying to process my feelings, and I was 13, maybe. I was in junior high school, and my parents got a hold of my journals and then confronted me. And the confrontation really was, this sort of fear that they had that I was somehow being, deceived or controlled by Satan, and that the only way to save me from this was to go to church. And so my parents had grown up in the Christian tradition, but we hadn't ever in my lifetime been active in the church. I've gone to church. I have memories of going to church as a young kid with my friends every once in a while. Like if I had spent the night at a friend's house. If they went to church, we would all go to church on a Sunday morning. But really, my family did not have the practice of going to church.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so it was my, my problem that inspired my parents to say, the only way to save our daughter is
oh my gosh,
to get into church. And so that's what prompted my family starting, really becoming a church family, a church going family. And that became our whole lives. That really did become our entire social network and identity. And so my faith development was very much tied to working out sexual identity and things like that too. So very quickly in that situation, I was introduced to kind of ex-gay notions of, what homosexuality is, like maybe theories about how it happens. And then certainly, if not that, the ways that the language could be overcome homosexuality, resist temptation. But certainly the idea is this is something that is horribly sinful. And I think, your question around sexuality kind of betrays something else that is sort of a hallmark, I think, about evangelicalism, not only evangelicalism, but definitely within it, is really this anxiety around sexuality in general.
I would, as you were speaking, Michelle, I couldn't help but remember, when I was 13, when I graduated junior high, was when my parents gave me a purity ring.
Oh, yes.
Because it was like, Lord forbid, you be a sexual girl.
Right. Yes. So I think part of evangelicalism and part of the theology that kind of is generated within that culture is a real anxiety or fear or suspect around sexuality. And I would broaden that out even more and just say around bodies in general. Anything bodily is to be seen as a potential threat. To purity, to obedience, to whatever it is, to truth. And so it was within that context then that my parents, started getting plugged into the larger kind of evangelical network, which would have included teaching or coming out of like Focus on the Family and James Dobson and things like that. I'm pretty sure.
Oh my God, I forgot about him. Wow, until you just reminded me.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's where they first heard about Exodus and about like ex-gay theology. So then, that provided an answer, a solution, right? This is how we fix / save our daughter. And so I remember as a teenager in high school, kind of starting to read things about, what had caused same-sex attraction for me, what I could do to overcome it, or just a lot of like, kind of approach to, this is sin. You don't do that. You just have to be obedient and you reject this. So I think my high school years were really spent, I think, because, I became a Christian. I accepted Jesus. And part of that was sort of, all right, I'm going to be a good Christian girl now, right? Like this is the way to, number one, gain acceptance in my family, gain acceptance socially, go to heaven, like gain God's acceptance.
The benefits are kind of, it's easy to see why, teenagers, especially who are so vulnerable.
Yes.
And I think super sensitive to rejection, just developmentally.
Oh yeah.
Why this would be so alluring, if you will. Because I think a lot of people who have not grown up in this environment struggle to see like, well, why in the world would anybody go along with this? And I think what you just, we're at that age, you're just so vulnerable to rejection, and And so if you've got a solution in front of you that seems like, okay, this is how I'm going to be accepted and loved, it's pretty tempting to just believe and jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think, during my teenage years, it was sort of being enculturated into that sort of approach to, homosexuality, but sexuality in general, sort of this sort of just say no, abstinence, purity culture kind of approach anyway. So you just apply that to homosexuality and it's like, well, basically just say no, just don't go there, cut yourself off from anything that might be a temptation.
Sure.
And it wasn't until college that I started becoming more familiar with Exodus as an organization.
Okay.
And when I, especially when I was getting more into, one of my majors was biblical studies. And so when I was getting more into that, I really sort of had this sense of like, I wanted to maybe go into ministry. And I was looking into kind of what that looked like. And of course, for me, because of my story and because of my experience, it was, well, maybe I could go into ExGay Ministry because I have this testimony that I've learned to tell now of, battling against this and things like that. It's something I could understand. It's something, that I had been given lots of answers for. And so I started researching where could I go do an internship. And in Fresno, where I was going to college, there was an Exodus ministry. So Exodus is like an umbrella organization for lots of ministries that then affiliate with Exodus.
Okay.
So it's a broad network of really at one point hundreds of ministries.
Wow. Okay.
And at some point they started building a therapist network as well. And so
that just makes me.
Wow. So I got connected, even though there was a ministry in Fresno. I didn't gain much traction on trying to get in, volunteer over the summer there or whatever. And so I actually ended up connecting with a ministry in Orlando, Florida. So the summer after my junior year of college, I moved to Florida for the summer, and lived with the director and his wife there, and basically learned, got kind of my crash course in more ExGay theology and sort of approaches to ministry. And, they had lots of like support group type things that they offered throughout the week to people who were, again, the language struggling with same-sex attraction.
Sure. Okay. Gosh, this is hard
it was really, yeah. I mean, it was really kind of like, almost like addiction recovery groups.
That's
really
what I was
the model.
thinking of.
That really was the model.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking of when you were saying that. I was like, it almost sounds like AA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of.
Yes. And so you would go, people would come to their support groups. So whether if it was a group specifically for women or whether it was for men or for parents of LGBTQ kids or spouses of somebody who had just come out, go to these groups. I mean, it really was sort of supposed to be a peer kind of support situation of, resisting temptation or dealing with, a loved one that was going through this journey. And because of my experience there, actually the person who was the director of that ministry, shortly after became the president of Exodus International. And so,
you were hanging out with that guy.
Yeah. So with Alan Chambers.
Okay.
And so when I graduated from college in 2002, pretty soon, within that time frame, 2001, 2002, Exodus had moved its headquarters from California to Orlando because Alan was taking the reins of Exodus. And so the headquarters moved to Orlando and they were kind of setting up shop there. And because of the internship that I had done, as I was approaching graduation, he asked if I would be interested in joining the team there. Coming on staff. And so when I graduated that May, I think it was like 2 weeks later, I was on a plane moving myself to Florida, and became the publications and office manager for Exodus International. So I was newly 22 and my first job out of college.
Oh, wow.
And it really was sort of this sense of, I'm joining this large movement, very influential movement, especially within the evangelical world. They were getting endorsed and doing partnering with organizations like Focus on the Family.
Yeah.
So they were really being embraced, and it was held up as, this is evangelicalism's answer to homosexuality, basically. And so I joined that staff really with sort of these dreams of, God is calling me to go into this ministry. My story is going to help other people change. Because by that time I had, I had kind of come to a place where the way that I understood my own identity and story was, this is something that I had struggled with, had, made mistakes, and had, finally gotten right with God and decided to be faithful and to overcome this. And it was something that I had left behind.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Broken Hearts Club. I hope you felt encouraged, curious, and validated. Delve deeper into the conversation by learning more about the work that I do by going to www.brookebergman.com. Until next time.